Welcome to AntArctic Stories, a podcast that takes you behind the scenes into the rich world of people who live, work, and undertake daring expeditions in the polar regions. My name is Heather Thorkelson, and I'll be your host today. Born in Scotland, a twin sister, Doctor Lesley Cadzow was entranced by medical books on tropical diseases from the time she was a child. Trained as a general practitioner in Scotland, her career began with being guided up farm tracks by lantern and learning quickly how to climb gates and fend off dogs in the country's northeast. On a grey day in Aberdeen, she decided to pull anchor and head to the opposite side of the world, New Zealand, land of volcanoes and fervent feminist pen pals, to a job as a pediatric registrar flying babies around the North Island, where she fell in love with the earthy, steamy Maori legends and culture. Moving to Australia after a couple of years, she spent a few years in Canberra in pediatrics before escaping to her real love, general practice, which since then has allowed her to travel to indigenous communities all over the country and learn about the first people of Australia. She worked for the Royal Flying Doctor Service, doing loop-the-loops from Alice Springs while loving the desert and rain over Uluru. Traveling to work by plane seemed to suit, so she followed up with a spell on Thursday Island, visiting the surrounding islands on the cusp of third and first world medicine. Pilot whales and turtles would have the whole hospital piling out for a look. Things shifted yet again when her diving partner from Glasgow University days hounded Lesley until she landed a job with Aurora Expeditions, leaving her breathless for 2 months while she anticipated her first expedition, a voyage around that wonderful country she still called home, Scotland. There she experienced the wild weather, people and sheep, sea stacks, and kayaking through rafts of puffins in the channels of the majestic, distant islands of St. Kilda, all while traveling by expedition ship. 15 years later, she scanned the Arctic for polar bears and walruses, snorkeled and enjoyed the culture of Papua New Guinea, and struggled through the giant kelp and stellar sea eagles guarding the volcanoes of Kamchatka, not to mention dealing with some of her ship's crew being unable to return to the ship as they were in prison. From the gentle sound and sometimes thunderous noise of the landscape to the joy of a polar plunge, as she was previously a synchronized swimmer, to mountain climbing where few have ever been, and the joy of writing the Penguin Post, composing poetry and having cabaret shows on board, singing at South Georgia and in the tanks at Deception Island, all of this shared in a community of people experiencing the most wonderful places in the world. Lesley has truly grabbed her polar expedition life by the horns. When not on the ship, Lesley is an acupuncturist and musculoskeletal medicine doctor in rural and remote Australia, and she has just been voted the People's Choice in Victoria's Rural Workforce Agency Awards this past year. She has even treated dogs and been at horse deliveries, but the most important part of her day is to make people laugh. Lesley's next challenge will be in the Western Simpson Desert on a scientific trip with camels. Dr. Lesley, welcome to AntArctic Stories.
Hi, Heather. Thank you for having me. And it's just a wonderful experience to be on twin tracks with you.
Well, we're so excited to have you. You came highly recommended by some of our really good expedition friends. And after reading that bio, I mean, my goodness, what an interesting life you have led. So I would love it if we could just start off with you giving us a little overview of your interesting and very international life as a doctor prior to your introduction to the polar regions. So I mean, like going back to, starting out in Scotland where you're originally from, and then tell us the story of what kind of brought you to starting in the polar regions.
Well, Heather, I think I was always destined to be a doctor. I had a twin sister, and my favourite thing was to pore through medical books and look at the ghastly photographs held within them. So, and I always watched the Dr. Finlay's casebook, our Scottish GP programme. So I was always heading that direction. I was a bit stalled at the start, though, because I started a science degree and had to swap over, mainly because I disobeyed my father in his choice of career for me. But eventually I saw the light, and I finished my career in Glasgow and wondered, what will I do one day, one grey day in Aberdeen? I thought, well, maybe I should head overseas. I'm all set. I'm a newly qualified general practitioner, very green around the gills. But I thought, well, I've always wanted to go somewhere volcanic, and I had lots of pen pals in New Zealand. So I thought that's the place for me.
That's very cool. New Zealand. Oh, that's so interesting. So you went over to New Zealand, and did you have anything set up there? Was there some kind of work that you had lined up, or did you just go there and think, well, we'll see how things go?
Well, I thought I had, but then when I got there, my job seemed to have fallen through. But eventually I did become a very experienced pediatric registrar in the North Island of New Zealand. And part of that experience was flying babies around the North Island. We would go and collect any premature babies and fly them over White Island or Tongariro on the way back to Hamilton in the middle of the North Island. It's a wonderful experience in a helicopter, also with a little baby to look after as well.
Oh my goodness. So you were how long were you in New Zealand for?
I was there for a year and a half and loved New Zealand. It was a place I felt very much at home. But then decided to move across to the West Island of New Zealand, which people in Australia will actually know as Australia.
All right. And then what happened in Australia with your career?
Well, it seemed like pediatrics seemed to be the pathway I was following. And I did a much more stable job in the capital city of Australia, Canberra, for another year, but then decided that really my real want was to go back to general practice, where I could be out of the hospital and really doing what I wanted, in a much more relaxed and much more wide sense of medicine, really.
Yeah. Okay. And then I understand that while you were doing that, you worked for the Royal Flying Doctor Service. Can you talk a little? I don't even know what that is, but it sounds really interesting.
Yes. In Australia, I would go back to Scotland and people would say to me, "Oh, so you work for the Flying Doctor Service in Australia?" Because obviously we had the Flying Doctor mini-series on television. And basically here in Australia, it's such a vast continent. We have people who fly around and, pick up patients from all over the country. So you call out the plane and the plane arrives in a community, wherever it is. And it's a life-saving service that was set up by a number of pilots initially, but has become a nationwide service now, so that no one is really stuck without medical care in the desert, wherever, in the islands around the coast. So people would ask me, "So do you work for the Flying Doctor Service?" And I go, "Oh, well, no, actually, I'm a GP in Melbourne at the moment." And they go, "Oh, that's a bit disappointing. So what's the next thing you have to do?" Is you have to, the idea has been planted. So now it's time to actually go out and actually push yourself out there and see what it's like. So I did end up going to, first of all, some of the Tiwi Islands, which are north of Darwin. And I did a GP locum up there in an indigenous community. And then I came back down to Alice Springs and actually worked for the Flying Doctor Service as a locum and flew all around the desert there to different communities, sometimes staying overnight, and just found the absolute beauty of the red centre of Australia, which is just phenomenal.
Oh, that sounds so wonderful and exciting. And already, this doctor career has taken you to just such incredible places and doing such incredible and diverse medical work, right? With different communities and being out in rural areas. And I mean, it almost feels a little bit like a movie to me. Like I want to see a movie of your life to this point. It sounds very, very enriching, I suppose, is the word that comes up for me.
Well, I think what happened to me was that I discovered that I quite liked going to work by plane in amongst all of this, because I also have had a spell on the Thursday Island, which is on the cusp between Australia and Papua New Guinea, to the islands just in the north there. And that was a fantastic job, because I walked about 2 minutes out of where I was staying and jumped onto my own private helicopter and headed off to an island for the day, just me and the pilot. So I was becoming a bit spoiled, and driving or cycling to work was becoming a little banal by this time. So,
yeah, no kidding.
I was being spoiled.
How do you ever return to like regular GP life after living that kind of life?
Well, the wonderful thing is that when I came back to Melbourne, where I worked for a number of years, and I'd scoot off in between times, patients were just fascinated by it. So they all became part of my adventuring life. They became part of the things that I was doing elsewhere. And they would sit and watch slideshows in my surgery for a long time. If I got called off to do something else, I could just leave them with a slideshow and they were quite happy. So everybody became part of the adventure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So from this point, after working as a GP in Melbourne and doing these little, side gigs here and there, was this sort of what preceded you starting to work on ships, or how did that transition happen?
Well, fortunately, my best friend when I was at Glasgow University and we were in the scuba diving club had an opportunity to go as an environmental scientist to Antarctica, to one of the bases. And when he came back, he described the emotionality of his trip and just how wonderful it was. And he said, I think you better get a gig there too. And I said, oh, no, that'd be no use. He wouldn't want me. And he harassed me for a couple of years. And eventually, out of frustration, I made a phone call. And that's how I ended up getting my first trip, which was to my native place of Scotland, which was amazing.
Oh, wow. So was it an expedition cruise around Scotland?
Yes, with passengers, about 50 passengers, And once I knew that I had the job, I was breathless for about 2 months before I went. So I jumped in. I thought, gosh, I don't even really know what I'm doing. What am I supposed to do in this ship? How am I going to manage? But somehow you just sort of throw yourself in and see what happens. And it was a wonderful experience to see all these wonderful islands off the coast of Scotland that I would never get to. The fabled St Kilda and Fulla, Fair Isle. These are just amazing places that not many people in Scotland get to go. And I was so proud of cruising around my own country as a start off in my career on ships.
Yeah, that sounds like a great way to start off. And it's so true. I mean, I'm from Canada and there's so many parts of Canada that Canadians never see. So beautiful parts, so I can understand how wonderful it must have been for you to see these corners of your own country that are, not often visited by your own people. And being thrown into that kind of environment, working on a ship, having never done that before, I can understand how that sort of gives you a little bit of like, oh no. But at the same time, based on what you've told us already, you had sort of done these leaps of faith a few different times, going into areas that you were unfamiliar with, just even sort of medical setups that were very, just unfamiliar, and done quite well. And I love that. I love that spirit that you have about you where it's like, okay, well, let's try this, let's just go and see what happens and have that sort of self-trust that you'll adapt and figure it out and be able to do what you need to do and do what you've brought in to do. But of course, Scotland is quite different from, and where you had been living, in New Zealand and Australia, that's quite different from the polar regions. Even from a medical perspective, the requirements of a medical doctor in more moderate climates are quite different from the polar regions. So can you tell us about that transition? Like what happened after Scotland? What did you go straight to the polar regions or how did that work?
Well, I must have passed my first test in Scotland. And being a woman, unfortunately, fortunately, women think about it long and hard and really almost undervalue their skills, whereas men jump in with all the bravado. But luckily somebody said to me, well, what about Antarctica next? Let's go to the Antarctic Peninsula. And I thought, okay, I don't really know about that either, but I know it involves that crossing across the Drake Passage that I've heard those horror stories about. But I thought, well, I've survived the first one. I'm sure I'll manage again. And, it's all a learning experience and everyone was very supportive. My father gave me special seasickness tablets that he was a bank manager. He'd researched and he made sure he sent me the right tablets that are required to go across the Drake Passage. So that got me there. I must admit, I was terrified the first time I came on the ship because I wasn't sure, what are my sea legs like,
Yeah.
I've been out in yachts and whatnot, but I felt this was a completely different experience. But I was very lucky and I'm usually fairly good. I don't get much seasickness, which was a great blessing because I know some doctors have been really challenged.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that can be really tough. And the Drake, as you said, is, infamous for being not the most friendly waters. However, I'm sure as you've been down there many times now, often we encounter the Drake Lake, which is a really nice, smooth sailing. So it's not always as bad as people worry about it being.
No, it's a bit of a disappointment sometimes. You feel as though you should have to suffer to get there.
So I have to admit, because we have some mutual acquaintances, some little birdies have told me that you have some very interesting stories from the years that you've worked on ships. And some of them involved humans, some of them involved animals. And one that really caught my attention was something around you being stalked by a pack of orcas. So I really want to get into some of these interesting stories of yours, but maybe we can start with the orca story.
Well, the good thing about being a medical doctor on the cruise ship is you tend not to do so much medicine eventually, and you become a polar guide, which is a wonderful thing for me that I've actually got to that stage and eventually was driving a Zodiac myself. My orca day started off just gently through the Lemaire Channel, going through the icebergs there, the iceberg alley. And I had a lovely Indian family with me, 6 of them in my Zodiac. And we came past a penguin that had an injury, and then a seal that also had a bloodied fin there. And they were asking me, well, what's the story behind that? And I thought, well, something's obviously got them. And so I suspect there must be orcas around here. And as we just popped round one of these majestic icebergs, one of the young guys said, there's a fin, there's an orca there. So I thought, oh, okay, let's just cruise over that way and see what's happening. And of course, as you know, once you get into that iceberg alley there, you know, you're kind of disappearing off. Everyone's lost to you. You're out there on your own. Mm-hmm. And we followed, and we got a few sightings, went a fair way. And eventually we were just sort of lingering against, I remember it was a kind of brownish bit of ice that we were sort of cushioned against. And we thought, oh, well, you know, we stayed there for a bit. And that moment of silence that you get in Antarctica that everyone looks for, where everyone's quiet, we're just waiting and watching and nothing's happening. Just about to turn around and head back when suddenly, and it was exactly like the David Attenborough footage where we've got three sets of two orcas coming from 3 different directions at once. And of course, the excitement in my Zodiac was palpable. And luckily, they were quite noisy because otherwise they would have heard my knees knocking. I have never had a moment of, you know, sheer sort of terror at the same time watching this magnificent spectacle that was happening round about us. But they were definitely trying to produce the wave, you know, where you see the iceberg wobble and a seal falls in, or, you know, that you've seen the footage, you know, and they were, the orcas were coming along right along the side of the Zodiac. Oh. Yeah, I mean, we could see the coloration, you know, very close and sort of nudging slightly. But luckily, we were sort of curried in against this iceberg. Yeah. And I'm on my radio to the rest of the team saying, we've got orcas. And the expedition leader said to me, where are you? And I'm thinking, I'm not entirely sure. I don't know if I can give you directions right at this moment, you know. So I was sort of trying to call in the people round about me at the same time, trying to keep the Zodiac steady, keep everyone in the Zodiac, and sort of watch what was happening here. So it was probably only a few moments of just amazing spectacle, really, all around about us. And certainly they were incredibly excited. In fact, I had to caution them to just lower the tone of things when we got back in case no one else had seen an orca, because it's so annoying if you have that experience. But it's certainly, you know, I knew how beautiful it was, but how it was just a little bit spooky at the same time. You know? So,
oh, no kidding. So, for sure. And as you say, like, you know, folks like yourself, doctors, all the different people that are on an expedition team, even if you don't come into the industry with guiding skills, most of us develop guiding skills and become fully certified guides because that's, you know, it's an important part of being on a team. But, you know, you're a doctor. I have my own specialization, which isn't anything to do with marine mammals. And so when we're out there and you're, you know, having an experience like this, on the one hand, you're thinking, okay, cool. Well, I'm just going to do my Zodiac driving, make sure my passengers are safe, make sure everything's good. But in a situation like that, where you've got these orcas coming at you and they're trying to create that wave that, you know, that they normally do when they're going after prey, suddenly you're probably thinking like, wait a minute, I'm not a behavioral expert. What's going on here? You almost want to call the marine mammal guy and say like, so here's what we're seeing. What should I do?
Yes, well, I don't think I've seen that happen with the Zodiac since. I mean, I've been out in the evening, you know, when it's almost been getting dark, and we've had the female and the young orcas round about the Zodiac sort of spy hopping close to us, but I've never seen them come at, you know, that was a moment of the stalkers becoming the stalked.
Yeah.
The tables had turned quite definitely. So I've not actually seen that again, And luckily, I think down in Antarctica, we've got type B orcas, which aren't as aggressive as the type A's. Mm-hmm. So that was a reassuring fact that I had gleaned from one of our naturalist lectures before. But at the moment, it wasn't entirely settling my knees at the time.
No, not at all. Not at all. And, not only have I never seen that happen, I've never heard of it. So that's one of the reasons why I really wanted to ask you for that firsthand account of what that story was. Because, that's, I think, a very, very unique and very unusual scenario. So, so that was your experience with orcas. What about medical emergencies? I'm sure you've seen a few over the years, and I would love to hear about anything unusual that happened that you had to take care of while you were either in Antarctica or in the Arctic, for that matter.
I think more of the medical emergencies seem to happen in Antarctica just because of the severity of the weather and the ice and a number of factors that are all come together. And of course, we've often had kayakers, climbers, and divers, which just adds another element of difficulty to any medical management there. And we did have an amazing fireman. I think he was actually from Canada. On one of our trips, and we'd been doing a practice, that I always felt that it was very important for us to do a practice rescue on the ship, because you just never know. And unless you practice every actual trip, you can't come together as a team, and the team's changing. I mean, he'd been very helpful and been helping us with a rescue the day before. And on this morning, the divers were out diving with leopard seals, and what had happened in his excitement, he hadn't zipped his dry suit completely, and so he had a small amount. And as he dived, of course, he got a big rush of cold water across his chest.
Yeah.
He recognized it very quickly, and he signaled to the dive master, who, of course, had to then gather the rest of the divers and get them into the Zodiac, and they did a circle around him, and they did all the right thing to protect him from the wind and to give him some warm drinks. But by the time he got back to the ship, and I was off leading a trek on the other side of the island. So by the time they got back to the ship and got back into radio contact with us, the expedition leader and I and the rest of the team started to gather, and we all sort of rushed back to the ship. The first thing that we found is that divers in wetsuits, big guys, are like Teletubbies when you're trying to unload a corpse. They were part of the rescue team initially, and actually coming along the narrow gangways on a ship became quite difficult.
Oh, yeah.
Just because they're quite big, and they were all in wetsuits, and they've made them in dry suits, and they became much bigger. So we eventually got our diver into the bar on the ship, which was the easiest access point. And by this time, he was actually unconscious from hypothermia.
Oh, wow.
And there are a number of things that as a medical person, you don't even sort of consider, even things like, how do you cut a dry suit off? It's actually quite a difficult thing to do if you can't get it off any other way. We actually managed to get him out of his dry suit with some help from the dive master, because he had cold water in there and he was cooling all the time. Mm-hmm. And we used a number of methods to heat him up, but he will probably still remember that he wakened up in a thermal blanket with two women attached to him, because that's one of the best ways of warming up a really cold body. So he wakened up in a rather compromising situation. Yes.
That's not a bad way to wake up from hypothermia.
No.
Oh my goodness.
So that was a very interesting, exercise of just rescuing someone from a long way away when they really had succumbed to hypothermia by that time, getting them back onto a ship, actually how you rescue them, how you even just lift them onto the ship. These are the days before our recent trips, which have got much easier access. Mm-hmm. And then, how do you slowly bring someone back up to temperature? Because the last thing you want to do is start rubbing feet and hands and moving them around. You need to do it slowly and gently. Mm-hmm. And we found that body heat is still the best.
Yeah. Wow. What an experience. And, it's such a good point. Like when you've never encountered certain very unique scenarios before, you've really got to think on your feet of like, how do we do this? How do we, re-embark them? How do we get them to a safe spot? How do we get them out of this dry? There's so many things that people don't realize when we're talking about expedition medicine that are just so unique to each different scenario. It's very, very specialized.
And it's also that thing about, your team are all very skilled in wilderness first aid generally, and they're fantastic. You would think that if this was a hospital, you'd have a whole intensive care and all the nurses and doctors and everything, but there's only one medical person usually, but the rest of the team take on that, and we're absolutely fantastic in that circumstance. So I've always relied upon my team very definitely, and they've always been absolutely amazing because they just know how to get on with things and do it.
Yeah.
So you suddenly, whatever team. I mean, the most helpful person to me that day was the person who was working in the bar, who a number of times was their first go-to person because they were there on the ship. They were the ones who were getting all the gear together and really helping.
Yeah.
That's a wonderful scenario.
The quality of the team is so critical, and the knowledge of the team. You may have heard of this, but there was a very unfortunate incident a few years ago where a guest was bitten by a fur seal in South Georgia. Bitten, I think it was the upper arm. And
no, I think it was actually on the bottom, I think.
Was it the bottom? Yeah.
Yes, I know the doctor that was involved with that. Okay. Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon. No, you're talking about a different scenario. That was the one where the vascular surgeon was involved.
Yes, that one, yes. Exactly. So a colleague of mine who I worked with later was one of the first guides on the scene, not like a medical doctor, just a regular kayak guide, actually, but of course with wilderness first aid training and whatnot. And because she was one of the first on the scene and she saw what was happening, she literally reached inside his flesh and pinched closed the vein or the artery or whatever. I'm not sure the right terminology, but she closed the part that was bleeding all over the place and sat there with her fingers inside his flesh, making sure that the blood wasn't gushing out of him. And the vascular surgeon said later on, if she hadn't have done that, he likely would have died. So, it's stuff like that you don't realize how important it is that the guides are really well trained and that that in those moments they don't panic and they know what to do, even if it's like a kind of a shocking thing to have to do, like what she did, And
you have to work with what you've got at that point in time. You haven't got any sophisticated stuff, But that's right. It's back to basics. It's actually human beings thinking of what can I use for this now, and that's amazing. Yes, that was a fantastic story. That one.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, it's so rare. I don't want to scare anyone who's listening that, these kinds of things. It's not like this happens every day. It's very, very rare. But, you want to know that if in a worst case scenario, something goes wrong, that you're going to be well taken care of by people who have been working in this environment for some time and are willing to be creative and do whatever it takes to make sure that you're okay.
Absolutely. And, it is a long way from anywhere. There's not medical help on tap. It's your crew and staff on the ship are your lifeline, really. They're the ones that are really looking out for you, looking after you constantly.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is no like medevac when you're in certain parts of the world, like the ones that we go to. So what about having to sew people up? Have you had to sew anyone up while out there in the wilds?
Yeah, we often have to cobble people back together. And often it happens, particularly on the small ships, when you're going through a storm, because that's the scenario. Someone's stood up, lost control, and usually come crashing through a door or crashed into something on the ship, So I remember a memorable evening where really people were trying to be confined to the cabins, but even there they weren't safe. And one lady who had gone over to look at the porthole, to look at the washing machine effect outside the porthole, somehow lost her balance, straight across the cabin, came out the door and landed in the arms of the chef who was walking past in a small towel after having had a shower. Oh my God. So she couldn't have landed in the best place with a young, attractive man dressed in a very small, skimpy towel. So he got her back into her cabin, and she had a big gash on her forehead. So, of course, at this time, there's many other things going on the ship. So I had an expedition leader and the chef to help me at this time, because everyone else was trying to batten down the hatches and keep everyone under control on the other decks. And it became a scenario where I was on my knees on the floor. And as the ship moved, of course, I was getting carpet rash on my knees as I slipped backwards and forwards, and I would get one stitch with each movement of the ship. My assistants were being very careful I didn't suture her to the pillowcase. That was one of their prime things. But they were very helpful because, when you've got people round about you who are really caring for you and looking after you, it made my job so much easier because they were very helpful with that. And then, of course, next door we had another guy who'd just ripped his ear off in another encounter, I think, with the shower. And so we sort of went from one to the next one, At the end of the day, although you think, oh, it's not the best job, in the best circumstances, but actually it's amazing how well things turn out, that you just try your best. And both of them, things looked fine the next day, despite the circumstances under which we'd been sort of trying to repair the damage. And I never learned at medical school how to suture in a moving ship, really. That was not one of my learning experiences. Usually things were fairly stable. So it's a whole different ball game on a ship, where everything's moving.
Yeah. And I mean, there's moving, like regular ship movement, and then there's dramatic ship movement, right? And often if you're trying to fix someone, I would imagine it's in those more dramatic scenarios. So it really takes someone with a steady hand and just a steady mind, I suppose, because you've got to be super calm and in the zone and just really focus on the work that needs to get done.
Well, who would have thought that you'd slide up and down the floor at the same time as you were doing suturing? And it seemed to be, that mechanism seemed to work so much better. It was like coming back through a rip. There's no point in fighting. You had to go with it and just get it on the way past,
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I learned a new technique that day too.
Oh, that's so interesting. So these are kind of, I've been asking you about some rather more dramatic elements of practicing medicine while on expedition, but I know that there's some other things that are more just sort of entertaining or interesting. Like I know you had mentioned something in our previous chats over email about trying to find contraception in the Orkneys and then doing acupuncture trials for seasickness. So what about some of the other elements of medical life at sea? What would you like to share with us?
Well, I think because I'm an acupuncturist, I'm a bit of a musculoskeletal specialist, here when I'm in Australia. I wanted to see if I could conquer some of the fear that's associated with going across, particularly the Drake Passage, because many people come onto the ship and fear and anxiety in that first 24 hours when you leave Ushuaia can sometimes be quite palpable. I'm sure it spreads as well. So we actually did a little acupuncture trial where we probably acupunctured 70% of the passengers on the ship. So we had people sitting with acupuncture needles all around the bar, into the cabins, out into the corridor.
Oh, wow.
To see if it would make any difference. And it's a difficult thing because it's really based on your own thoughts of how seasick you might be and whether you think you did better than you did before. Mm-hmm. But there was a sense that people felt that maybe it's a psychological thing, although acupuncture isn't always psychology. Mm-hmm. Some feeling that they felt they had done better than they would have thought. And it was a fairly severe Drake, so it was tested. Mm-hmm. But I've often used acupuncture on the ship for muscle injuries. Many of our crew and guides actually get various injuries jumping around and moving around. So that's been very helpful and useful. So the other side of things is that, on the ship, I've always found that, especially going to the polar regions, it's such a dramatically different thing from anything you do anywhere else in your life. Mm-hmm. There can be a bit of anxiety and depression, and all sorts of things can surface, because it is so vast and it's so amazing. And that's the thing that we need to, as crew and staff, we've always been very careful to try and sort of watch how people respond. Mm-hmm. The incident you talked about with the condoms in Scotland was one lovely Russian crew member who decided he'd fallen in love on the ship and required contraception. And sent me out into the rather constrained religious atmosphere of the Shetlands.
Goodness.
To go to a chemist to buy some condoms for him with all these passengers walking past. And so it was one of the most anxiety-provoking things I've ever done. To out the door of that chemist with a brown paper bag in my hand, and go back to the ship and give him the thumbs up. We're all set. After that, we decided maybe we should have condoms on the ship. After that, it's not a thing that I'd thought of before, but the crew have their needs. It's their home. It's their place for such a long time. So, we have to look after all the things that are involved with that, just like the normal medical services.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Like the doctor isn't just there for the, doling out seasick meds to passengers or dealing with any kind of minor or major injuries, but also, as you say, the crew and even the expedition staff. Certainly I fell really ill in my first season, just with, I don't know if it was the flu or what, but it was pretty extreme. I was really sick. And I was really relying on the doctor to help me get through. I wasn't well enough to drive Zodiacs or anything. I just basically stayed on board and did what I could on board and tried to recuperate. But it's so important and to sort of recognize that role of the doctor. You're there serving the entire micro community of the vessel, because there's the crew and the staff, and the crew in particular that are living on the ship for, often months at a time. And they're like a little ship family. And then even the guests, when the guests step on, a lot of the trips to the Antarctic Peninsula are around 10 days, but a lot of them are longer. The South Georgia trips are, 20 plus days. And because you're cut off more or less from the regular world, these days we have more and more internet on ships, but not everyone. Because you're cut off, it does feel like this mini universe, like this mini little world, this little family that you're going on this great adventure with. And I just think that every single member on board is so critical, and the doctor in particular, and the doctor within the greater team that's assisting them in taking care of everybody is so critical. And I love that you pointed out that element of sort of mental well-being, that for some people going down or to the Arctic, whatever, going to these remote regions, it can throw you for a loop, right? It does bring up a lot of big emotions for some people. And it's not a bad thing. It's just when you're separated from regular life and you're cut off from the regular inputs that we get on social media and whatnot, being quiet with your own thoughts, being in an environment that's so vast and makes you feel so small and such a sense of wonder at the same time. That's why these experiences are so transformative, right?
And that feeling of being a little bit out of control, that you can't control your circumstances. If you're a business executive, suddenly you're doing things that are just, hairy and scary. Yeah. One of my experiences was actually to have one of the staff who actually got hit on the head with a little lady's elbow. It didn't look like a major injury, but she got a major concussion from that. Oh. And actually drove towards me in the Zodiac and just crumpled as she advanced towards me. And she, despite her best efforts, she wanted to, every day she'd get up and come to the door of the dining room, then she'd collapse there. We'd have to take her back. So she actually couldn't stand up for about a week to 10 days. And it was very important for her to actually, have the rest of us sort of cluster around and sort of protect her and also help her to do her job. She still did her job, but she did it from the cabin.
Yeah.
So she sent us all off scurrying like little mice all through the ship. She gave us jobs to do and she kept us very well organized, but she was unable to get out of bed. Yeah. Even worse is when something happens to the doctor, because I haven't had many injuries, but on my last Antarctic trip, I actually ruptured a Baker's cyst. I felt it pop as I jumped out of bed one morning. I thought, that feels a bit strange. And headed off on one of our trips and landed on the beach, managed to get the passengers off and thought, well, I can't walk any further. I'll just have to stand here. Loaded everyone back on, got back to the ship. And I actually was unable to get up and down the stairs by that time. So I actually had to put myself to bed and hope that everyone else came and looked after me, even to the extent of bringing you some food and things, because I was unable to move for 24 hours. And then it got better and I was back on track again. But, it doesn't take you long to get yourself quite agitated and quite worried about what you're going to do next, and quite depressed, if you're stuck in a cabin on your own. And we've got to make sure we find those people, make sure they're okay, that we don't leave them being seasick for 4 days and nobody's come to check and make sure that they're actually okay, because they can get quite despondent about it and just be desperate to get back off the ship again. We don't try not to have that happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that's where the entire team being plugged in and communicating and working as one sort of organism with separate limbs is so important, right? Because we're all involved in the well-being of all of the passengers and each other.
Yes.
Yeah.
And, even dinner time could be a wee bit of a hazard too. I had a gentleman who was actually an American physician who told me he had something he thought stuck in his throat.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a vegetarian, so I didn't notice that on the menu that night was lamb shanks, because it wasn't anything to do with me really. And he had managed to get a spicle from the bone of the lamb shank stuck right across the back of his throat, which I could see with horror. I could see it there. And I thought, gosh, there's only one chance to get this with something, some instrument that's long. I've got one chance to grab this before we're really in trouble here. And as always happens in these circumstances, somehow everything goes together. The ship didn't move. He was very accommodating. I had my best head torch on, and somehow we got it. Just like afterwards, that was amazing. I had no idea I could actually do that in those circumstances, and I've managed to pull that out without having to think what we're going to do next. How would we get it out? Without anaesthetizing this chap, and we're a long way from anywhere.
Yeah.
So sometimes I think we're just very lucky, but maybe it's just it's like all the polar expeditions before. Somehow things came together, and somehow Shackleton and Scott managed to do things that it was almost impossible to think of before. That maybe it's just things that it's the whole environment somehow makes you so much braver than you were before, perhaps.
Yeah, I wonder about that, like braver and steadier, and maybe you just go into this sort of tunnel vision zone where you're in the zone, right? And you can do things that you didn't otherwise imagine that you could, or come up with solutions that you didn't otherwise imagine, if you had not been put in that scenario.
Called desperation, I think.
Yeah.
But somehow it works out.
Yeah. And interestingly, on that note, just with the gentleman that you helped there in the dining room, I don't know if this has been your experience, but a doctor that I worked with previously said to me that, in fact, the most common problem on ships is people choking at dinner or at a meal, choking on something. So that really surprised me, because I haven't personally experienced that much over my years as a guide, but apparently statistically choking on things during a meal is one of the things that requires the most doctor assistance.
Yeah. I think my experience with meal times was, particularly in some of the smaller ships, is just the fact that the meal arrives and the whole ship moves, and there's a whole array of crockery and food, and everything's moving from one person to the next, to the next, to the next, and then the people start to move as well, and then it all gets very exciting. And then the chefs are struggling in the kitchen, trying to hold oven doors closed and trying to stop things spill. I once, when I was helping in the kitchen, we used to go into the kitchen to help, and I was washing some pots. I thought I was being very helpful, and the ship moved. And I had some hot water, and first of all, I smashed down onto my ribs on the side of the sink, and the pot tipped, and the hot water ran down to the lowest part of the ship where the chef was standing, and I think actually burnt his foot.
Oh, poor thing!
So now both of us have got an injury, and sort of counselling and caring for each other. But I'm going, "Oh, burnt your foot," and he's going, "No, but your ribs, are your ribs okay?" And I think, "Oh, I'm all right." And again, everybody comes to help and sorted us out. Everyone else looked after us and made sure that we were all right.
Yeah.
We haven't had very many choking experiences, certainly in Antarctica, which is good. Mm-hmm. But the other thing that we forget about is that people come onto the ship who are blind, or who've got terminal cancer, or who've got cerebral palsy. Mm-hmm. People come with things that are just amazing, but they've got such spirit and such adventure that they somehow are going to get there. How can you come to Antarctica and not be able to see?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But you can smell and you can hear, and that was a wonderful experience for me, to actually be with someone who had different senses from mine, and I started to taste and smell things I never heard, or just the ice tinkling and the smell she would be describing to me and I'd be describing the visuals, and it made it three-dimensional now.
Oh, that's so amazing. It's so true. I've also traveled with some people who have all kinds of different, challenges, and it really does open your eyes, and also remind you, like, that's the thing about places like Antarctica. First of all, nature is so massive and so in charge that you're reminded of how small you are, which is really humbling. I think it's a really nice thing. It reminds me that my problems are actually pretty minuscule. But then to have people around you that are, blind, or like I once traveled with a gentleman who couldn't walk. And so my husband, who's this big strapping Swede, he would lower this gentleman into the Zodiac and drive him over and then pick him up and take him onto shore. And we'd bring a chair over and he would just sit in this chair and watch, the goings on the landing. And like, he was just the most lovely man. And it was so like wonderful. It was the best part of that entire trip for me, was getting to chat with him about what he was experiencing, in spite of the fact that he couldn't physically move around. It's really something. I mean, Antarctica and the Arctic, these far regions of our Earth, are just so transformative in so many ways. And every trip is different. I think that's why some people go back again and again. I mean, guides notwithstanding, but passengers, there's something very, very special about the whole thing.
Yeah, and I actually even wonder if the wildlife recognise, seeing seals and penguins just gradually creep closer and closer to that person who's usually sitting much stiller and is much more part of their own environment. The lady who had poor vision, it was with me, she sat still, and a wiener elephant seal eventually came right up to her, and actually its bristles touched her face because she sat there quietly, and she couldn't see it until it was almost like a hand away from her face, and then she felt the bristles, and I said, that wiener seal has come all the way straight over to you, almost made a beeline for her.
Wow.
And somehow, I don't know what we're communicating, or the animals are picking up on that, but yeah. It's a beautiful thing to see,
It really
so
is.
You don't miss out. You don't miss out, even if you haven't got all the faculties everyone else has. Sometimes you're quieter and you get a better experience, or a more exclusive experience,
Yeah, it's very true. Or you're just less distracted because you're not moving around and thinking about the next thing in the same way that everyone else is, so for sure. I mean, I feel a little bit, Lesley, like we've scared everyone a little bit, but that's the nature of interviewing a doctor, because we're going to be talking about things that sound a little bit less appealing than other things. But we've kind of come full circle and talked about the wonderful things as well, and hopefully instilled some confidence in the folks who are thinking of traveling to these regions that, you're going to be in very, very good hands. But I would love to ask you, as we sort of wrap up, what is your most precious memory from the polar regions? What memory really sits with you and was the most transformative for you?
I think my best memory is actually an episode where I was actually land sick coming off the ship, and I was staggering around like someone who was drunk on shore, which has only happened to me once. And because of that, I actually had to just find myself a space in behind some rocks, away from everyone else. I just sat down because I couldn't do much else. And I just sat for an hour with penguins coming in and out of the water, that sort of penguin behavior just round about me. And I felt as though at that time I was the only person that was there. There was no one else there. I could hear no one, I could see no one else. It was just me. And now I was part of the landscape, and because I wasn't moving, it was just a wonderful experience, really, to really listen and to smell and to be part of this vastness and this incredible diversity of wildlife that's there, and they're getting on with their normal life. And you sometimes wonder, all these people are coming ashore, and do we disrupt what they're doing? But it didn't seem to be. It seemed as if they were intent on eating and mating and getting out to sea and whatever other behaviours penguins have at the front of their mind at that time in the season, looking after their chicks. It didn't seem as I was actually intruding on that at all. And it was just a very special moment. I think most people find that special quiet time where you're just on your own and suddenly you're in it. You're not with anyone else. You're just there yourself, and you're completely immersed.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. It sounds absolutely wonderful. I've certainly had a few moments like that myself. And They're quite indescribable. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. Now, I do understand that you have a different kind of expedition coming up. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, because I've been grounded this year. I've decided to go off with the Ships of the Desert this time in Australia. I've been very lucky to have another little expedition land in my lap. And so I'm going off on a camel trip into the Simpson Desert with some scientists and paleontologists. So we're actually going looking for the wildlife of the Simpson Desert, the red centre of Australia. And so we'll be walking with camels. And so I'll be getting my first learning about how to look after camels and hopefully exploring much more of this country, which I now call home, Australia, in a much more, because I'm going to be walking and I'll be part of the landscape again. It's a completely different thing from flying over the desert or driving through. It'll be much more a minute experience. So I'm looking forward to that. So that'll be a different idea this year. And that's the thing in our lives. We get all these opportunities and you just have to put your hand up and say, yes, even though I don't know anything about it and I don't know if I'll be any good, but yes, I'll come. I'll be there.
Oh, that's so great. It's so inspiring. I love your spirit. I think it's just really wonderful. And I do hope, do you plan to eventually do more expedition cruise doctoring in the future down in the polar regions?
Yes. Well, there's still places I haven't been to. I'd love to get to the Ross Sea. I'd love to go back to Eastern Antarctica, and there's certainly plenty now along the northern Russian coast here now that the ice is changing in the Arctic. That means that there's going to be many different places that are becoming more accessible as well. Mm-hmm. So yes, I would like to continue to explore. I don't think I'm finished yet. My father always said to me, and I think it was in regard to if someone asked you to dance, never say no, but I think it actually refers to the rest of your life. If someone asks you something, you think, I could probably do it, then just say yes. Don't even think, just do it.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And I certainly hope that we get the chance to share stories on the ship someday, because I'm going to very much look forward to hearing about your camel crossing of the desert. Yes. Well, thank you so much for spending time with us today on Antarctic Stories. It's been wonderful to hear about your experiences, and I hope that the listeners are just as inspired as I am. Thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you too, Heather, and thank you for giving me a chance to blether. It is a thing I seem to be fairly good at. And it's just been wonderful to chat to you as well. You've got a great warmth, and I've loved the questions that you've asked. It's been wonderful.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of Antarctic Stories. Make sure you hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any future episodes. And if you have an extra minute, leaving a rating or review for the podcast will really help us in reaching a wider audience. Antarctic Stories is a production of Twin Tracks Expeditions, a family-run agency of polar guides who have spent the last decade working on polar expedition ships. We bring you unparalleled insider expertise in small ship voyages to the Arctic and Antarctica, and we love sharing our insider knowledge to help you find the perfect ship for your next polar expedition. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, or at twintracksexpeditions.com.